Coming off the heels of a very disappointing loss on the road to the Carolina Panthers is Broncos general manager George Paton on the hot seat. We take a look at some of Broncos Country's biggest criticisms, which ones are valid and which ones do we need to apply a little bit of logic to, not to mention Nathaniel Hackett met with the media on Monday, and it's a little bit of a different tone in the Valley. You get that much more in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you're watching on YouTube. We know the season has not gone how anybody has expected, but we have you covered every single day, all year long. Your team every day. We live up to the promise here from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, my friend, the aftermath of a loss, as we've all encountered this, and I'd say pretty much every week this season with this Broncos football team, there are a lot of angry fans. And look, I want to preface everything by saying Broncos Country has every right to be angry. Broncos Country has every right to be frustrated, because what we have expected of this team coming to the season simply hasn't even been close. It's been a massive failure. It's been a massive disappointment. But in moments of high emotion, high outrage, hindsight, revisionist history, we're seeing some wild stuff out there about Broncos GM George Paton. We'll talk about all that on today's episode of the show, but they really preface it by saying, like, this episode, should George Paton be on the hot seat? There's a lot of angles we can approach this from.
Yeah, there really is, Cody. I mean, I posted some stuff on my Twitter page on Monday just to kind of get the beat of where Broncos Country is at. And as you would expect, I mean, it's very passionate. It's very, very passionate especially after a loss, but even more so after, 3 straight losses amidst a 3-8 start, which it has actually been the norm recently. And it's just unfortunate to say that, because that's not that's not what this fan base has come to expect through the decades, right? Obviously, what we all expected and what we hoped for and what we dreamed of is what we saw with Peyton Manning right away. Even after a sluggish start, winning 11 straight games or whatever it was back in 2012 and getting to the playoffs, looking like one of the most dominant teams in the NFL pretty quickly with Peyton Manning at the helm, has not been the case for Russell Wilson. And because of that, not only has it been bad with Russell Wilson, but it's been historically bad. This is the lowest scoring offense since the year 2000, Cody, back when I believe that would be Brian Greasy still quarterbacking the team at that time for the Denver Broncos. I mean, that's a long, long time ago. And certainly for most Broncos fans in this generation, nobody's really known anything quite like this. I mean, even back in the Josh McDaniels days, I remember a lot of highlight reel plays from Brandon Lloyd, right? So there was still some decent things happening back at those times. You had the Tebow year in 2011, which was miserable for a bit, but you still found a way to win games at the end. Now it's like the offense is terrible. You're losing games. There's a lot of seemingly strife among the players or coaches or both, just from the outside looking in. And George Paton is the guy who is the architect of it all, right? So there's a lot of people out there in my Twitter mentions, I'm sure yours, in the comment section of the show here, that want George Paton to be held accountable by being fired. But that's the big thing right now. It's like, I mean, do you really consider firing a guy who he was voted, Cody, by his peers as the most trustworthy executive in the NFL? And I know that only goes so far, but man, you look at what he's done up to this point, the fact that he pulled off the blockbuster trade for a QB in the offseason. I know fans are having buyer's remorse right now, but cool heads will prevail. What are your thoughts in response to what people are saying, Cody, in terms of the people who want George Paton to be fired?
It's wild to me, because George Paton, like Sayre, let's go back to the moment where, we were all believing that, Aaron Rodgers was going to likely come to Denver because Nathaniel Hackett was the head coach. Rodgers announces he goes back to Green Bay. Moments later, we get a notification. Russell Wilson traded the Denver Broncos. National media, us, fans, like a good portion of the fan base, I'd say like 99% of the fan base. Oh my gosh, Broncos Super Bowl contenders, Russell Wilson. Oh my gosh, George Paton, executive of the year. Give it to him now. And now that we look back and we see that the results have not panned out, everyone's like, oh God, this was the worst trade ever. Like, oh, George Paton, I can't believe he did this to us. But it's like, where's the consistency? Because when the trade happened, he was crowned. Everyone crowned him. Everyone said, okay, Denver, they're Super Bowl contenders. That was the expectation. Nobody in this world, Sayre, nobody in this world ever envisioned the Broncos offense, and in particular, Russell Wilson would look the way he has looked. Nobody, not one person. If there's one person, maybe Seahawks fans. Seahawks fans are pretty jaded towards Russell Wilson. Maybe they had an idea. Maybe they had an inkling. But at this point, it's like, all right, because in fact it hasn't worked out so far, and right now, I mean, you can make the argument. It is on pace to be the worst trade in NFL history, considering the expectations of what you're able to give up, the players, the draft capital. But everyone after that trade was like, F them picks. Yeah, we like that. What happened? Like, why do we get so deep in this revisionist history? That was the right move to make at the time where Denver was at. Nobody, not one soul thought things would go the way that it has. And I think that now that we look back 12 games into the season, we're like, oh my gosh, like this sucks. Like this is weird. Like this was unexpected in every facet. I think fans have every right to be frustrated and have every right to be angry. But it's like we're also misplacing that towards George Paton because we were so ready to crown George Paton executive of the year. Like, oh my gosh, he's the best. He's the best in the business. But because this has not worked out and nobody saw this coming, oh, get rid of him. People want to talk about accountability. Here's where accountability starts, in my opinion, Sayre. I know there's some other things we'll dive into, like legitimate reasons for fans to be frustrated with George Paton. We'll dive into that a little bit later here in the show. Accountability is letting George Paton do his work and fix this, right? What did he do? He traded Bradley Chubb, which, we were like, we're not really big believers in doing that, but they acquired a late first-round pick from the 49ers more than likely. Okay, so they get a first-round pick back. They'll have a first-round pick in the 2024 NFL draft as well. So it's not like Denver's crippled in the sense, right? They're stuck with Russ in his contract, however. I think that there's some other things there. We'll talk about, like, the contract extension before even playing it down. I think that has a lot of merit into fan frustration, and rightfully so, valid criticism towards George Paton. But to sit here now, 12 games into the season, and say George Paton's got to go because this has not worked out, that was a gamble. Like everyone, you make that move where Denver was at because we were all talking about it. Quarterback away, right? Unfortunately, hasn't worked out that way.
Right. And I think you're exactly right, Cody. You're spot on in talking just about the fact that it's the right move at the time. And I think even now, looking back in hindsight, it's a trade that if I were the GM of the Denver Broncos, I make that trade 100 times out of 100, even knowing what we know now, because look, you took a swing at the fences for a player that's been pretty much a top 10 quarterback his entire NFL career, giving us really no indication to believe that he was going to be in the bottom half or bottom 10, bottom 5 of the league this season. Yes, some people had mentioned his play dropped off a little bit in the last couple of years with Seattle. Obviously, nobody's really taken into account the finger injury last year, the fact that he came back the final 7 games last season as the Seahawks are kind of winning a little bit more. Russ has a QB rating of, I believe, Cody, it was like 104.7 or something like that, where he had 15 touchdowns and 3 picks over the final 7 games last year. So even down the stretch last season, if you get that version of Russell Wilson, I mean, the Broncos are looking really good right now. So that's just, I mean, even if you get the most recent version of what he was in Seattle, nobody could have seen this potential decline coming. And I told you off the air, I kind of refuse to believe he's hit this kind of a low in terms of a drop off, just because, man, you just don't see this kind of a thing happen. And so what I think, Cody, is that firing George Paton is kind of a ridiculous idea at this point. I do think there's areas that he needs to be held accountable. But look, the only way to hold accountable in Broncos country these days is seemingly to fire people or cut them or trade them or do all these sorts of things. And really, I mean, we're finding out, as we did with the Bradley Chubb thing, you beg for a guy to be cut or traded for 3 or 4 years, and then all of a sudden he finally does get traded, and you're harping on the GM for trading a player. Yeah, what's the deal with that? We love Bradley Chubb. He was a cornerstone piece. He was setting the edge. Like, I can't stand it, Cody. It's so crazy. The goalposts are moving far too often. And I think for anybody that's listening right now, we got to understand, we got to stop moving the goalposts, right? You got to live with some of the decisions that you make as a GM. And the Russell Wilson contract, we'll get into that, Cody. I'm excited to talk about that because I can see both sides of that argument. I think as of right now, not a fireable offense for George Paton signing that contract with Russell Wilson before the season. We can talk about that a little bit more here coming up.
Well, one of the things we're going to talk about coming up here on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, what are some valid reasons Broncos Country has some valid criticism over GM George Paton? That's something we'll dive into on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. But this episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over at Turo. And Turo is the world's largest car sharing marketplace. And with Turo, you can book any car you want, wherever you want it, from a community of local hosts. You can browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the U.S., UK, Canada, and Australia. Book a spacious SUV or minivan for a family road trip, or get a classic or luxury car for a special event, birthday, or holiday. Find affordable economy cars if you're on a budget and just need to get from A to B, or test drive that new electric vehicle that you had your eye on to see how it fits in your everyday life. Many Turo hosts can even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Forget boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. Broncos general manager George Paton deserves criticism for many things. We're going to take a look at some of the valid reasons that Broncos Country has to be frustrated with some of the moves that George Paton has made. However, putting things into perspective, it doesn't make sense to move on from George Paton despite how disappointing this Broncos season has been. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in, making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, whether you're watching on YouTube. If you're a first-time listener or first-time watcher and you love this Broncos content, we bring it to you every single day all year long, because there's never an off season for the true fan out there, and we have you covered, your team, every day. Sayre, my friend, let's dive into some of this stuff here, because I think there's some valid points that you and I have been talking about, and we address maybe the reasons why the outrage towards George Paton isn't warranted, but there's also some reasons why there is some outrage and valid criticism that is warranted towards George Paton. Let's take a look first now, like in hindsight, 12 weeks into the season, the hiring of Nathaniel Hackett, man, it simply has not worked out as much as we were excited about Hackett, the energy, the good vibes that he was giving off. I mean, you and I described it as he's like the real life Ted Lasso in a sense. Unfortunately, the results are not similar to Ted Lasso when it comes to winning games. So let's talk about this Nathaniel Hackett hire, because I think that when you look back on it, and especially with George Paton, this was a huge risk for him, and so far it hasn't panned out, and it's leaning towards a potential one and done.
It really is, and I think that's going to be the case, and I think you can kind of sense that. I wonder if Nathaniel Hackett can sense it. You know, watching his Monday press conference, and you were there, Cody, to me, the vibe just kind of seemed like, hey, we got to get through these next handful of weeks, and that's about it. You know, that's kind of where we're at with things, but it does. I mean, the hire is looking worse and worse by the week. Like we mentioned in segment one, you know, the offense is looking historically bad. It's been historically bad. Russ doesn't seem to be taking steps forward. He seems to be taking steps backward. There seems to be just no unity among Russ and Hackett in terms of being on the same page offensively. I mean, even Hackett deciding, if it was his decision in the first place, Hackett deciding to give play calling over to Clint Kubiak, he's kind of like washing his hands of everything beforehand. He's like, all right, I'm giving game management up. I'm giving up play calling. I'm going to show you that, like, look, my hands are here. You're accusing me of stealing something. Look at where my hands have been this whole time. Yeah. You know, that's kind of the vibe that we're getting from it. And Hackett is like, look, I can't do anything. And I think there is something to be said for that on Russ's end. But at the same time, you go into a season, you need to be able to design an offense that is, you know, a perfect fit for Russell Wilson, incidentally, right? I mean, that's exactly what you need. You can't have anything else than that, because Russell Wilson is your most important player. He's your biggest investment. So I think the fact that Paton kind of, you know, brought him in the first place, chose him over maybe not the greatest candidates, but also didn't, you know, interview all the best candidates, like Brian Daboll doing a great job with the New York Giants. And, you know, maybe that was the only job that he wanted. But, you know, Kevin O'Connell, he came in for an interview, or the Broncos interviewed him, and they didn't give him the job. That he got the job in Minnesota. So there's just different things there that, you know, Paton, he had a shot to get some good coaching candidates, didn't do it. Now you're in a situation where you might have a one and done head coach in your first head coaching hire as a general manager in the NFL.
And that's really what he's going to be judged on, right? But I also think with that, he also deserves the opportunity to fix it and try to make things right, because that's what accountability is. It's being able, okay, hey, I made a mistake. Let me be accountable. Let me try to fix it, right? And if you can't fix it and the solution never gets better, okay, then you have grounds to, I think, do some of these things that fans are alluding to here. I also think, and I know you were very outspoken on this as well, like going into free agency, going into the NFL draft. You and I were having many discussions here on this very podcast about the Broncos maybe looking at offensive line, looking at, even adding to the wide receiver room, right? Because you have Cortland Sutton, okay, we imagine, okay, he's going to be a wide receiver room. You have Tim Patrick, okay, you're getting Russell Wilson. These guys, Jerry Jeudy, KJ Hamler, okay, the optics of those guys there. But you even said, like, considering some of the injury history, the Broncos should invest at wide receiver just because you never know. And unfortunately, the non-contact ACL to Tim Patrick, bam, he's out. Jerry Jeudy has the ankle injury, the freak ankle injury a few weeks ago. Bam, he's out. KJ Hamler pulling a hamstring. Bam, he's out. And he's also missed some games this season due to the knee and not being fully ready yet from that standpoint. These things now glaring up as really big needs. And on top of that, take, some free agency gambles as well.
Yeah, you take the free agency gamble on Randy Gregory, who we talked about it at the time, right? I mean, missing time, whether it's injury or suspension, he's missed a lot of time as an NFL player. And here we are. I mean, he had the scope. I don't remember how many weeks back it's been, Cody, but certainly within the
5, 6, 7 weeks.
Something like that. I mean, it's
injury happened week 4.
Yep.
We're going on. Oh gosh, we're going on week 3. Oh man,
yeah.
We're this deep into it.
Yeah, it's tough, and Ronald Darby unfortunately came in with injury concerns. You kind of hoped after his year with Washington, maybe, okay, he played 16 games that year with Washington. Maybe he's turned a corner. Unfortunately, injuries have once again been part of his story, and that's allowed you to see Damari Mathis. But at the same time, you spent 3 years, $30 million on Ronald Darby to be a top tier starter for you at that key position. K'Wan Williams, you bring him in. He's obviously played through some injury this year, which has been admirable. He made that great play against the Jaguars, right? And he's been very, very good when on the field, but it's the same type of deal as with Bryce Callahan. Remember, whenever he was on the field, he was playing great, but man, it was like you were seeing a lunar eclipse or something like that whenever he was on the field, because he just wasn't out there. And that kind of seems to be the case with some of these free agent pickups. You banked a little bit too much, I think, on Billy Turner. I mean, being your starting right tackle, he hasn't been able to be healthy this season. There's just a lot of different factors, a lot of different pieces. I know you can't do everything all at once, but looking back at the NFL draft, I mean, hindsight is always 20/20, isn't it? But certainly when you look back, there were a lot of Broncos fans calling for Washington State's Abraham Lucas there at the bottom of round 2, who's been a starter for the Seattle Seahawks at right tackle, projected by many as a starting right tackle in the NFL. Could have killed that need with fire. Instead decided to take a player that's been, 4th or 5th in your rotation, Nick Bonito. He's played a big role this season, but man, you would love to have starting right tackle solidified, knowing that you have those edge positions kind of stacked up right now. So it's those different little things. I think, okay, that's not nitpicking on George Paton. Those are things that the masses, a lot of us, could see. Hey, here's the risk you're taking here. You're not signing Von Miller. Instead, you're signing Randy Gregory, who has this injury history. We'd rather roll with Von, who, yeah, he has a recent injury history, and he ironically also injured this year for the Buffalo Bills. But at the same time, who are you riding with there? The guy that you know, the guy who wants to be there, or Randy Gregory, who nobody knows in Denver. I mean, I know, I'm sure he's a good dude and good in the locker room and things like that. But at the same time, which risk are you more willing to take, or should you be more willing to take? And yeah, price factors in. There's complicated things there as well. But man, those are the things that you look back in hindsight as, hey, the masses were kind of on board with something else, and you zigged when the masses were zagging, and it's not working out. Those are the kind of things I think George Paton should be held accountable, especially like you mentioned, the wide receiver thing, Cody. That's such a premium position in today's NFL. You got to have guys out there. You can't bank on the guys that have been injured the last couple of years. That's a tough thing to do. So there are reasons out there, I think, to be upset at George Paton. But like you said, accountability is not just, all right, fire him, get him out of here. It's give him a chance to fix it and come back, because being a GM in the NFL, it's not a 1 year, it's not a year-to-year job, and it can't be from a fan's perspective either. It has to be a 4 to 5 year thing to see, can this guy turn the ship around?
I think those are very fair points, and I'm hoping that these conversations you and I are having here with Broncos Country, hopefully it allows people to kind of see the forest through the trees, right? Something we say here on the show quite a bit, but it's so true in a situation like this. And hey, a little bit of a bold take here early on, but I would not be shocked if the Broncos look at wide receiver with their first round pick that they're going to have from the 49ers. Never know. We'll see exactly what happens. But yes, George Paton needs a chance to fix some of these things that have not gone as he has planned and had hoped for. That's the name of the game. In Broncos Country, Nathaniel Hackett met with the media on Monday as well. I was there in person in Dove Valley. A little bit of a different tone, as Sayre alluded to. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. And this episode is brought to you by Audible. Audible is releasing a slate of new football podcasts that we're sure you're going to love 110%. Find Block Forever now wherever you get your podcast. Block Forever is a brand new podcast from former NFL All-Pro Ryan Khalil and Audible as they've partnered up. Khalil takes the conversation about football to the next level. One thing he does, he sits down with star players, coaches, former teammates, and former pros across the league to get real about what happens on the field and behind the scenes, inside locker rooms, during team meetings, and even at team hotels. It's available for free on Audible or wherever you get your podcasts right now. So catch the full Block Forever series available anywhere you get your podcasts, available everywhere now. Audible. Get in the game. As we dive in the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, I want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country tuning in, making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We have you covered on your favorite audio podcasting platform or whether you watch on YouTube. Sayre, the mood, I feel like as we get down, we dwindle down. You have the Ravens this upcoming week. I'll be in Baltimore for that game. Then you have the Kansas City Chiefs. You play them twice. You have the Chargers one more time, the Arizona Cardinals. And then you have the LA Rams. And it's to the point where fans are now counting down. They're like, can the season just be over? Like, they wish they could hit that sim to the end of the season or sim to the NFL draft, like it was Madden. But this is where we're at. And, and a lot of fans were expecting that Nathaniel Hackett was going to be fired after the Panthers game. That's obviously not the reality at this point in time as we stand here on the show airing on Tuesday on your favorite audio podcasting platforms. But Nathaniel Hackett he was asked a question about the fan base and, are you aware of how frustrated they are? And he acknowledged that by saying, nobody's as frustrated as I am. And look, I do want to say there is validity to that. Like, while Broncos fans are angry and frustrated, I can tell you being in the locker room after games, Hackett's frustrated. He's angry. The players are frustrated. They're angry. They're down. Like, you could hear a pin drop inside the Broncos locker room after the losses. Like, it matters to these guys. I know it's something that doesn't nobody talks about that, right? Because we always want to be like, there's so many platforms, so many outlets out there. Oh, these guys just don't care. I can tell you with 110% certainty, these guys care. They care a lot. It's their livelihood. It's how they make money. It's how they set up the future foundation for their entire family and their future with their kids. This is super important to them. And I don't want that to be lost in the fact that this team is struggling and they're not looking very good.
Right. And I think that a lot of times, Cody, people kind of want to imagine the NFL locker room is like an episode of that. What was that old ESPN show with the guy from the side character from Smart Guy? I forget the name of the show, but you kind of want it to be like the super crazy drama where all the most like dramatic examples of everything in the locker room are happening. And it's just like, that's not the reality. Like, this is these guys' real life. These are guys that, I mean, more than just coworkers. Like, you see these guys for hours on end every single day. You're doing life together, among other things. So it's not like you can just, be holding a grudge against somebody on the roster or the coaching staff and not have to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. These guys it's their real life. But I think that's what gets lost a lot of times with Nathaniel Hackett. Like, we got to remember, like, he's a real guy. He's a real guy. He's not the coach on Madden that you can just fire and sim to the end of the season and just, all right, let's move on. Like, no, this is a real dude who's, getting a shot and an opportunity and it's not going well. So at least on some level, you can empathize with that. I don't think that Nathaniel Hackett wants the Broncos to be bad, right? And I think he is telling the truth. Like, nobody's as frustrated as I am. I think he would have loved to have seen this work out in a long-term fashion and be that next coach to, come in and, like we talked about before the season, these new quarterbacks going to new teams and winning right away, like Tom Brady in Tampa Bay, Matthew Stafford in Los Angeles. We hoped that Russell Wilson could be the next. I'm sure Nathaniel Hackett did as well. And it's just not working out. The reality of the NFL is setting in, like we mentioned, in the first segment. He's was very serious at this press conference. It wasn't as like, there's a lot of times he's very loose, very positive, very smiley. This was very direct. This was very, very straightforward. It wasn't like hey, here's a joke on top of what I said that was serious, or it wasn't like here's a reference to something else. No, it was very serious throughout, and you can tell that Hackett is, I mean, not that he's struggling. I mean, he's a pro, but he's up there and he's feeling it, man. He feels the pressure. I think he feels the weight of it. And I think Broncos country's got to understand that he's not just out there like, well, I guess we'll see what happens this week. Like he's upset about it. He hates losing, and we all do.
No, spot on there too. And like, there was a question I want to ask. Eric Dalal actually asked it before I got a chance to, so hats off to him. But my question I wanted to ask Hackett today was more along the lines of, how do you ensure that, like, you and the coaching staff, like the message you guys are preaching, how do you guys ensure that it's not falling on deaf ears, or like it's not becoming stagnant as you guys go through this losing streak right here? Because I think that's super important. Like, what is the message? How does it change? Like, you're going through the worst time period in more recent memory for this Broncos team. How do you ensure, like, when you're standing up there addressing the whole team every week, that people are like, oh, yeah, here we go, another week? That, I think, was something I was curious to hear a little bit more about. But I did have a chance to ask him about the offensive operation, second week under Clint Kubiak. And I remember the comment section last week. We were like, okay, hey, Clint, he's taking over the play calling. Thought he did some really good things in that first game against the Raiders. Unfortunately, losing overtime. And then, the second week, it's different. Like, Denver would have one positive play, like Tavis Murray, 52-yard run. And then all of a sudden, strip sack, you lose the ball. Like, how has the operation been? And he said that he's been pleased with how Clint has handled things. Like, they were able to run the ball well, and Clint's very reflective in a sense. Like, he's very critical about what he feels like he could have done or should have done. And that's part of the game, and it's part of the growing pains that we talk about. But here we are. Like, he said, they're going to continue to work with it. They're going to continue to work through it. You only have a handful of games remaining, and it's like, what can you do that's going to make things better perception-wise? I mean, Sayre, it's hard to see like there's going to be anything positive to take out of the offense for the remainder of the season, because you're playing the Ravens, Lamar Jackson, you play Patrick Mahomes twice, and I'm just asking the football gods at this point, please spare us from a primetime game against the Kansas City Chiefs. Please flex that to the afternoon so I can get home and enjoy my evening afterwards, because I do not want to stand out there and a primetime game against Patrick Mahomes and now Melvin Gordon, who's now a member of the Kansas City Chiefs. Like, it's just not fun. Flex that game to the Chargers and the Dolphins, please. Save us all the embarrassment of getting rattled on national television. That's all I ask at this point in time. So we'll find out here in the next 24, 48 hours if that is going to be the case. But Sayre, my friend, today's episode was a really good conversation. I really enjoyed your points of view on it. Broncos country, feel free to get involved in the conversation. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you comment on the video, your thoughts, your analysis on things that we talked about here today. Share your perspective. We always respect that. And always remember, if you're going to interact with Broncos country, keep things civil and respectful with one another, as we all, know it's frustrating. But don't take it out on other Broncos fans. Have an open, civil conversation. We appreciate you so much. We'll have you covered all throughout the week here as we build up to the matchup on Sunday against the Baltimore Ravens and Lamar Jackson. You get that this week here, Locked On Broncos.